Hi, I'm Katie, the host of Yappin' About History podcast, where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. This week's episode topic comes from the novel The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. I recently listened to the audiobook version, and the narrator was so good. Her name is Jonice Abbott Pratt, and she did such an amazing job of bringing all of Tananarive's characters to life. I highly recommend listening or doing a combo listening while reading, because Jonice is that good. And I'm gonna say Reformatory is definitely in contention to be my favorite book of 2025. Now, I don't want to give too much away, but The Reformatory is part horror, part historical fiction, part literary fiction, and it's about a young black boy, Robbie, who is sent to an all-boys segregated reform school in the Jim Crow, Florida South in the 1950s. The book follows Robbie and his teen sister, Gloria, as they try to find a way to get him safely out of the school while being confronted and haunted with the horrors of racism and injustice of both the past and the present. Robbie can see haints or ghosts, and Gloria can sense people's futures. While I was reading the book, I kept asking myself if the horror came from the haunting or the realities of what life was like for Black people in Jim Crow South. And I think that that's the devastatingly tragic brilliance of this book. Tananarive pays homage to her dad, John Dorsey Due Jr. Tananarive pays homage to her dad, John Dorsey Due Jr., who was a freedom lawyer, aka a civil rights attorney, by naming one of the lawyers in the book from him. She says that she also used his firsthand knowledge of negotiating with Jim Crow era judges to write a scene in this book. She also pays homage to her deceased mother, Patricia, who was also a civil rights activist and from whom she got her love of horror, by naming the sister after her mother's nickname, Gloria. Due says, "My parents were basically my first superheroes. Their courage and their commitment to not just Black rights, but to human rights left a very strong impression on me. It was a pretty extraordinary household." There are also a couple of historical Easter eggs with some of the people that Gloria meets throughout the book, so be sure to keep an eye out. But the part of Tananarive's story that I wanted to focus on was where she got the idea of writing about a boys' reformatory set in Jim Crow South in the first place. See, she had named the main character Robbie Stevens Jr. after her great uncle, Robert Stevens, who she didn't know existed until a phone call she received about 10 years earlier. The Office of Florida's Attorney General had called her to explain that her great uncle might be buried at the Dozier School for Boys. Any evidence of his existence had seemingly been erased from both her family and at least attempted to be erased by the state of Florida. It turns out that in 1937, the real-life 15-year-old Robert Stevens died while imprisoned at the Dozier School for Boys, likely the victim of a stabbing. There's also a 2020 novel called The Nickel Boys, written by Colson Whitehead, that is also based on the Dozier School, and there's a movie adaptation of the book. I didn't get a chance to read or watch this before recording, but it's going on the list. Before we get into this, I just want to say that this episode centers around child abuse, so if that's not something you want to hear, you may want to skip this episode. We'll also be covering a story of lynching, which is also very violent. So if you want to skip that part, I'll let you know, or you'll know when it's coming up. In addition to reading The Reformatory, I also read We Carry Their Bones, The Search for Justice at the Dozier School for Boys by Erin Kimmerle. Erin has a PhD in forensic anthropology and was the lead researcher in the project to locate the unmarked graves at Dozier and identify any remains found, and this was done through the University of South Florida. She does a great job of weaving in the histories of the county, Florida in general, and the Dozier School into her writings on the investigation. It's really fascinating, and it shows how knowing your history is really important. I would like the record to reflect that I have labeled this next section as Glaze Erin for a bit. But in all seriousness, she has had such a fascinating career. In the book, she goes into a little bit about the work she has done, and she now teaches at USF. She is the executive director and founder of the Florida Institute for Forensic Anthropology and Applied Science. But she's also been a part of the UN's International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia as an anthropologist working in Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, and Kosovo. Her job was to analyze skeletal remains for cause of death to be used in war crime trials. She has also worked for the Smithsonian. In reading this book and seeing how they do all the historical research, then do the archaeological type stuff, and then go back into the lab and analyze it, I'm like, I think this is what I want to be when I grow up. But anywho, I thought I'd start off by talking about how the investigation into finding and exhuming the unmarked graves at Dozier got started. And with most American stories, it starts with a land sale. The state wanted to sell the land where the Dozier School had been, but there were advocacy groups like the White House Boys and local reporters saying that they can't because there's all these unmarked graves there. Even though it was still functioning as the North Florida Youth Development Center in the lead up into this investigation, it was reduced in size. So we're talking about the unused part of the land is what they wanted to sell, and that is where the unmarked graves were supposedly located. And that's how Erin and her university get involved. A friend of hers had introduced her to a local reporter who had been working on a series of stories about the Reform School's dark history, about brutal beatings and sadistic guards and mysterious deaths. And just to give you an idea of how big a deal this ends up being, Erin ends up doing 35 press conferences over the course of 4 years while working on the site from 2012 to 2016. Now, a little bit earlier, I mentioned a group called the White House Boys, and they were men who are now in their 60s and 70s who were survivors of the school and its horrific abuses. They called themselves the White House Boys after the building in which they were abused by men who ran the school. Erin says, whether you were white or black, you took your beatings in the White House. But let's back up a few years to 2008. As the White House Boys began to organize, they approached the state seeking official acknowledgement that they had been abused and hoping to find some resolution along the way. They found an advocate in the former state legislator who now worked for the State Department's Juvenile Justice Department, a man named Gus Barriero. Gus set up a ceremony outside of the White House to close and seal it up and to put a plaque up on there that reads, "In memory of the children who passed these doors, we acknowledge their tribulations and offer our hope that they have found some measure of peace. May this building stand as a reminder of the need to remain vigilant in protecting our children as we help them seek a brighter future. Moreover, we offer the reassurance that we are dedicated to serving and protecting the youth who enter this campus and helping them to transform their lives." Now, what is really a sick twist of fate is that while this dedication and plaque are being put up onto the White House, there was a new set of incarcerated boys on the still functioning side of the school that are watching this ceremony take place, but they're not allowed to go outside, so they can't really see what's going on or why these people are there. And they too were also being abused and neglected, but the world wouldn't know about it for much later. The White House Boys were getting some recognition and the public spotlight, so the governor at the time, Charlie Crist, called for an investigation to determine who or what was buried on the grounds and if any crimes had occurred. He said, quote, "Justice always cries out for a conclusion, and this is no different. If there's an opportunity to find out exactly what happened there, to be able to verify if there was these kinds of horrible atrocities, we have a duty to do so," end quote. And it seems at this point people were starting to take this seriously and that they'd finally get some answers and that the atrocities that occurred could be corroborated and the children who died there could finally receive a proper burial. A few months after this, more than 300 men had contacted a lawyer who agreed to bring a lawsuit against the school and whatever old guards were still alive pro bono. And the state seemed willing to investigate the abuse and to even explore criminal charges if evidence was there. This really impressed some of the advocacy groups like the White House Boys and reporters because it didn't really seem like they were going to be taken seriously. However, that hope was short-lived because in May of 2009, after a 6-month investigation, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or FDLE, agents issued a report that said that they found records to indicate that 29 boys and 2 men had been buried at Boot Hill, the name given to the burial ground area. since the school opened in 1900, a body count that matched exactly the number of pipe crosses that had been placed there in the 80s. They also said, quote, there was no evidence to suggest that the school or its staff made any attempts to conceal and or contributed to the deaths of these individuals. There is no evidence to support that an unidentified perpetrator exists or existed that was responsible for any of those individual deaths. End quote. Therefore, from witness testimonies, records that were examined, and all information currently available, the FDLE determined that there was no indication of a criminal predicate to warrant further investigation into this matter. The investigation pertaining to the school cemetery was closed due to lack of evidence as defined by the Florida statutes. In regard to the investigation, the special agents relied heavily and sometimes exclusively on incomplete or deteriorated records kept by the school officials, which were the same men accused of the abuse of beatings and rape. So do you really think that they're going to write down their own crimes on the school ledgers? Come on, let's be for real. The FDLE investigation also found a box of letters written from concerned parents throughout the years asking about their kids, and this box potentially had some maps of the property, which may have had notes on the burial sites, but the investigative team got rid of all of it because they had, quote, no evidentiary value, and anything deemed not to have that value was destroyed. Erin says in the book, quote, personal letters no doubt would have told the stories of mothers and fathers reacting to the school's practices, pleading with state leaders for mercy, and now they'd been destroyed in the state's final chapter on the reform school it created and protected. End quote. In order to talk about the investigation onto Boot Hill, I think it's important to kind of get a lay of the land and learn a little bit about the history of where it's located, and that is Marianna, Florida. It's referred to as the City of Southern Charm, and it's in the Panhandle area of Florida, the little part up north that sticks out in Jackson County, and it's really close to the Georgia and Alabama state lines. Before the Civil War, giant plantations sprung up across Jackson County, and enslaved people provided much of the field labor in the wealthy agricultural hub, with cotton fields for miles in every direction. That changed in September of 1864 after a fight known as the Battle of Marianna. A quarter of the male population of Marianna died that day. When the Union soldiers left, they marched 600 formerly enslaved men, women, and children who were freed after the fighting. And locals today are very big into reenacting this battle, and gatherings of the sons of Confederate veterans is quite popular there. To get an idea of how Floridians took to losing the Civil War, let's check in with the governor, John Milton, and see what he has to say in 1865. He owned a 6,300-acre plantation and enslaved over 300 people. He gave his final address to the state legislature, saying he believed that, quote, death would be preferable to reunion, end quote. So he went home to his big plot in Jackson County and shot himself in the head. So you could say that they weren't really going to take Reconstruction and Black equality very well. Also, interesting side note, it would be Milton's land that ends up being the site for the Dozier School. His descendants had offered the most land and money to the state to build it. Jackson County was also notorious for being the most violent Reconstruction-era county in Florida. They even had a period referred to as the Jackson County War during this time that lasted 3 years and claimed the lives of over 150 people. And this residual post-war hatred would continue on for generations. But it wasn't just a Jackson County issue. Between the end of the Civil War and World War II, it's estimated that over 4,000 Black men and women were lynched nationwide, and entire African American towns were violently destroyed and erased from the map, like in Rosewood, Ocoee, Greenwood, and even in Marianna. Jackson County, not surprisingly then, also had a big KKK problem. It was said that it was so thoroughly dominated by the Klan at every institutional level as to render the county and state governments completely powerless to stop them. In a congressional hearing about the KKK, one of Florida's state senators, Charles Pierce, testified saying, quote, Satan has his seat. He reigns in Jackson County. End quote. One particular lynching that occurred in Jackson County in 1934 was described as one of the most gruesome to have occurred. And trigger warning, this is where we're going to talk about said lynching. Not much is known about Claude Neal's life, but what we do know is that he was a 23-year-old black farmhand with a wife and a 2-year-old daughter. It was rumored that he was having an affair with a white woman on a neighboring farm, and when she is found dead, the sheriffs arrest Claude. He never got to have a fair trial because he was taken by a white mob called the Committee of Six about a week after being arrested. They advertised the lynching in the newspapers as a lynching party in the week leading up to their kidnapping. Reporters estimated that about 5,000 people turned out from 9 southern states, their cars lining the dirt roads in both directions. The kidnappers accidentally tortured Neal to death, which upset the huge crowd because many had driven hundreds of miles in hopes that they could have a hand in the killing. When they finally got their hands on Claude Neal's corpse, they removed fingers, toes, and pieces of clothing as souvenirs. They attached his body by a rope to the bumper of a truck and drug his body around 13 miles from the alleged victim's house to the courthouse, where they strung his body up from a tree and took pictures of it. People printed out these pictures as postcards and sold them for 50 cents as souvenirs. Because so many people had flocked to see this lynching, some did not make it in time because the sheriff had removed Neal's body to bury it. A mob around the courthouse demanded that he bring his body back out so that they could hang it back up again, and the sheriff said no. This turned into a riot, with a white mob injuring around 200 innocent black people making their way onto the street. The mob also attacked and injured 2 white police officers who were among those trying to suppress the disorder. The mob headed into the black areas of town, looting and burning houses. The Florida governor had to call in 129 troops of the Florida National Guard to suppress the riots. And no one was ever brought to trial for the lynching or for the rioting. Again, this was in 1934, and most of my grandparents were toddlers by then. So this is not that long ago. And I think this is really important to tell these types of stories and to remember those who were violently murdered. And this also gives you an idea of the type of place that Jackson County was in the early 1900s. The Dozier School for boys had been up and running at this point for 34 years. And if black people were treated this horrifically out in public without any repercussions at all, imagine the horror that those children saw at the Reform School. Now let's talk a little bit about the precedent and systems in place in Florida that would not only allow for the Dozier School to exist, but for there to be a need for it. And no, it wasn't to help the bad kids. Florida relied on the convict lease system to house and maintain individuals convicted of crimes. And a lot of this is due to the fact that they did not have any income tax. The system placed men, women, and children together into labor camps where they would work for the person that had leased them. They were able to do this by taking advantage of a loophole in the 13th Amendment that makes slavery and involuntary servitude illegal except as a punishment for a crime in which a person has been convicted. So this meant that the convicted criminals created a labor pool that was then exploited by the state and private industry for decades. More than 90% of the leases were black men. The men who ran the convict lease programs were not sworn law enforcement, yet they could legally discipline convicts in their care, even legally shooting and killing convicts who tried to escape. The same was true for the Reform School. Most of the deaths in the convict lease system were undocumented and underreported. And we can still see this today in our current prison systems, with many of them now being for-profit, and black people making up about 38% of the prison population, while only making up 13% of the total US population. And there's still a lot of prison labor that is used today. There's also a lot of agricultural work that is done by prisoners, even dangerous work. Like in California, I know that prisoners work on wildfires. There was recently investigations into Alabama prisons that leased out prisoners. Their state laws say that businesses have to pay them the prevailing wage, but the corrections department is allowed to take 40% of that plus charge fees for necessities of the prisoners, like laundry and transportation. And this is definitely a topic that I want to dive more into in the future. So now that we have found a way around the 13th Amendment, how do Southern states get the prisoners that they need? Well, they passed a series of laws known as Jim Crow laws. These laws controlled the movement and wealth of Black people following emancipation. For example, vagrancy laws made it illegal to not have employment or a home address. Apprenticeship laws sent orphans and children of poor families to work for plantations and labor bosses. And the government denied citizenship to Black people by refusing to issue birth and later death certificates. Erin says in the book, quote, "And here it was, the perfect recipe for the reform school we had come to investigate, and an explanation for how 5-year-old children could be sentenced for crimes by a judge," end quote. She describes the scenario for how the boys wound up at schools like Dozier. It often went like this. A boy was picked up by a sheriff or his deputy and brought before a judge. No lawyers represented the boy. The authorities rarely, if ever, notified the boy's family. None of those protections came until after civil rights legislation, a century after emancipation. It's crazy. The labor agent pays the fine, and the defendant was sentenced for a minimum of a year. The labor boss covered housing, food, and maintenance of the convict, who worked to pay off the court fees plus all expenses charged to him, such as that housing and food. Specifically at Dozier, when a boy's release date would get close, the parents were told to send money for a bus fare home. Those that could not afford it were not released. The boys were hired out by the school to local plantations and other industries to work for their bus ticket, and while accruing the expenses for food, housing, etc. It was a vicious cycle designed to keep the wheel of cheap labor turning. Though Florida was among the last of the southern states to outlaw the convict lease system for adults, reform or industrial schools for convicted juveniles were exempt. The use of child labor continued until labor laws forced them to reform in the 1960s. Providing the first real protection for minors. Isn't that wild? The 1960s. Okay, so now that we've talked about the history of Marianna and how convict lease systems worked and how the reform schools came to be, let's talk a little bit more specifically about the Dozier School. It first opened in 1900 as a juvenile prison for both Black and white kids, but it was segregated, and in the late 1950s, a second site opened called the Okeechobee School, and the abuse followed along to that side as well. While the school's founding purpose was to rehabilitate and educate boys who were arrested for serious crimes, it quickly evolved into a much-feared penal institution and work camp, many of whose inmates had been sent there for things like incorrigibility, truancy, or dependency. Imagine that, kids being sentenced for dependency, like, hello? Some were sent to Dozier for smoking in school. In some cases, the boys' only offense were being abandoned children, orphans, or ward of the state. And this was mostly so that the school could have a source of free labor to make money. And this is evidenced by school leaders lobbying to increase the number of boys sent there and asking for control over their release dates, rather than leaving sentencing up to the judges who convicted the boys. Farming on school property was profitable thanks to the free labor, and soon officials at the predominantly Black school were asking the state for ways to make the boys' sentences longer. And we have quotes, people. This is not just, we think that they did this. No, like they were writing out saying, hey, send us more boys, give us the power to sentence them, etc. For example, one superintendent wrote in 1906, "Having so few inmates makes the crops come in slow." One of the other superintendents, W.H. Milton, asked the governor to authorize that, quote, "incorrigible children be sent without conviction for an indefinite period, leaving the term to be fixed by the management," end quote. And, not surprisingly, from the jump, abuse allegations and investigations plagued the school, but little was done to stop it. In her research, Erin found 6 state investigations of the school within its first 13 years alone. The reports included incidences of abuses such as brutal whippings, shackling children to the walls, and leasing children to area businesses for peonage work that brought profit to the school and the Marianna community. A 1903 report, so this is only 3 years after it opening, called the school, quote, "nothing more nor less than a prison," end quote. In a 1913 committee investigation, they found several boys chained as a form of punishment, the youngest only 5 years old. There were also reports of inadequate medical care, overcrowding, rodent infestations, sickness, and the murders of students allegedly by their peers. Attendance records from the 1930s show that African American boys as young as 5 years old were convicted of delinquency by the courts, but in contrast, some white boys during the same time period and of the same age were orphaned and sent to the school without any criminal charges. It got so bad that the reform school hired a publicist to try to generate more positive coverage and keep the stories of escapes and lawlessness under wraps. And instead of actually trying to, stop and prevent these awful abuses from happening, they instead hire a PR team, which to me is so insidious because it shows that they knew what they were doing was wrong and that they were going to keep doing it. The school also put its best foot forward every Christmas, setting up elaborate light displays, plywood nativity scenes, and waving Santas built by the wards. And this was a very popular for the area. But nothing changes and the school stays open, even though multiple public reports through newspapers and investigative journalism are published all the way up into the 1980s. For example, in 1958, the Miami News published a 3-part series on the beatings called, quote, Marianna's Two Faces. The journalist Jane Wood reported that 7 psychologists resigned in a 2-year period in objection to the, quote, routine beating of boys. End quote. One of those psychologists, Dr. Eugene Bird, said, quote, there are beatings delivered with the full force of a grown man. They wear out the straps on the boys. End quote. Bird also testified to the abuse before a U.S. Senate subcommittee, and he said that 15 to 20 boys were beaten in the White House every Saturday. The only thing the staff disputed was the severity of the beatings. Survivors say that they witnessed or experienced sexual assault, rape, severe beatings from the guards. They were also forced by the guards to fight other boys, often forcing the smaller boys to fight the bigger, older boys. The guards would then bet on these fights. They would also shackle boys' arms and legs and leave them like that for hours. They'd be put into solitary confinement for days or weeks at a time. And these were young boys whose crimes were things like skipping school or smoking cigarettes. Some recall that the guards threatened them as they left Dozier. We know where you live, and if you ever tell, we'll come find you. Some of the survivors have said that the guards said to them, so they never talked about it. Now that we've got the history of Marianna and the Dozier School for Boys, let's get a little bit into the investigation of the school grounds by Erin and her team. But before we get into those details, I did want to highlight some of the community's reactions to the investigation and allegations of abuse. And having just talked about the history of the area, I'm going to guess that you will not be too surprised by it. I think the biggest thing the community was upset about was that all this attention got the school shut down. It was closed in June of 2011 after 111 years of operation. This also meant that 200 jobs and $14.5 million in state funding were also gone in an area that was desperate for jobs. The institution was an integral component of the local economy through farming, agricultural production, document printing, and brick making. The official reason for closing the school was budget concerns and a drop in demand for beds and juvenile lockups across the state, but the locals blamed the out-of-towners and their bad publicity and that they were trying to stir up old trouble. Many locals accused the White House boys of lying about their time at Dozier, either for publicity or to sell books that some of them had written. Leading the criticism was a man named Dale Cox, a local armchair historian who took pot shots on his blog and wrote stories arguing that nothing was amiss at the old graveyard. He even tried to get Erin arrested at one point for supposedly violating her permit that they had gotten to work on the Dozier School property. At the same time, the local weekly newspaper published columns that were critical of the White House boys. Outrage from many local residents who worked there during the era in question, wrote publisher Sid Riley in the Jackson County Times, quote, they felt that they are the victims of a witch hunt motivated by media sensationalism and the personal greed of 2 former detainees of the Reform School. Since the school was opened in 1900, there have been hundreds of thousands of man hours expended by thousands of hardworking employees who were dedicated dedicated to helping the wayward boys who were sent there. As a result of their work, thousands of Florida's troubled youth were positively influenced, end quote. And just as a quick side note, this is 100% not true. The school did so much more damage to these boys. Not only were they severely abused and, the trauma that comes from that, but the Marshall Project, a nonpartisan, nonprofit news organization that seeks to sustain a sense of national urgency about the U.S. criminal justice system, did a review of Florida's death row inmates and found that at least 34 boys who had stayed at the Dozier School and another 16 from the Okeechobee School ended up in Florida's death row. And at least 19 others, and maybe more, were sent to prison for murder, but were not sentenced to death. 25 of them killed when they were ages 15, 16, 17, or 18, which would be like really soon after leaving the reform school. Combined, men who attended the Dozier and Okeechobee schools have killed at least 114 people. So, yeah, I don't think the Dozier school positively influenced those young boys. Anywho, back to the locals. An archivist who was an older white woman told Erin that the boys at the Dozier school were, quote, throwaways, and that she believed that most of them did not have any family. Erin noted that the woman, quote, was not going to concede the slightest bit of empathy. I would come to experience that same reaction over and over. Resolved in her opinion, she came across as angry. I just wasn't sure how much of it stemmed from my presence. Throwaway children. That was the phrase used in the FDLE report. Whose narrative was this? End quote. Given Erin's experience, she wasn't that surprised by the community's reaction. She said that anytime there's an effort at truth and reconciliation in a small town where a bright light of publicity shines on some dark deed, the powerful people in town try to control their truth, or at least the thing that's true to them. The irony was that they were accusing that team of destroying graves that they at the same time were saying didn't exist. So, what is it? Are all these out-of-towners lying, or are they disrupting the peace of the boys who were buried there? The locals called Erin unethical. They accused her of trying to get African Americans riled up. They accused her of secret communications with reporters. They accused her of focusing on negative examples and ignoring the thousands of boys who benefited from their stay at the school. And they said that the wards at Dozier had it better than at home because at least they got clothes and food. Erin describes an interaction that she had with a county official while touring an old plantation, and I was simultaneously flabbergasted, but yet not surprised by this man's beliefs. Let me read it to you. On a tour of an old plantation, one county official told me that blacks only had it bad after the war. The Civil War? I asked, astonished. He corrected me. The War of Northern Aggression. That was when it fell apart and they became impoverished, he said, without white caretakers. Before the war, they worked on the farms and had a place to live and were cared for like one big family. And he believed this. His was the same communal mentality that wanted to preserve a moral, decent image of Dozier. End quote. And again, this is a county official in the 2010s. Like, what the fuck? Erin goes on to describe the segregation she saw when giving public updates or meetings. If it was organized by black ministers or the NAACP, those in the white power structure would not attend, and they would actually get mad at Erin if she did not offer a second meeting for them. And then she goes on to say that this kind of like being offended by this then kind of turns it around to make these white people seem like they're the victims. But all the criticism makes more sense when you see how connected everyone is to the school and its history. For example, the town's tourism director, who claimed that the investigation was hurting the economy, was married to the lawyer who represented Troy Tidwell, the so-called one-armed man who was accused of beating so many boys, he'd been the focus of a class action lawsuit. Another example, the county commissioners who were opposed to the project were the ones bent on selling the land for economic development, and the police chief's father was the administrator at the school for years. All right, so now let's get into the investigation. In a state as old as Florida, we're going to have chapters in our history we're more proud of than others, but there is no shame in searching for the truth. And this was Agricultural Commissioner Adam Putnam. And I think this is a really appropriate outlook to have on the situation. When Erin and her team began their investigation, what happened to the boys at the school became a historical justice question. This means that the goals would be to find out the facts about what happened, try to figure out who was involved, and try to determine why it happened and to find out where the boys were buried. This is a very different set of goals than the FDLE investigation because Erin and her team did not have to work within the confines of a criminal investigation, and they weren't concerned with statutes of limitation or when certain acts like child rape would be statutorily criminal. The historical records for deaths at Dozier School weren't very thorough and had a lot of missing information. An example of this is the school records might have just written runaway or died off campus, but then the death certificate for those same boys would read blunt trauma to the head or shot by persons unknown. 7 boys died after running away from the school. Other records were even more vague, with all of it saying is unknown reason for death. 22 boys died in the care and custody of the state of Florida in the United States of America, and no one working for the state could point to those boys' specific graves nor say with any certainty whether they were even buried on the campus at all. 8% of boys died following attempted escapes. 23% of boys died within the first 3 months of being remanded to the school. Half of those died within their first month. 30 days. And these boys were dying. They first used ground penetrating radar to mark out the areas. Their original permit did not include exhumation or any digging at all. So that became a whole new battle with the authorities and the locals because the ground penetrating radar did find graves. And that's where the local historian tries to get Erin arrested because he claims that she violated the permit by digging into the area. But these were test trenches, which is very common for this type of work. And it kind of shows where soil has been disturbed, and that is a sign of burials or human disturbances. But through the back and forth, and after a couple denials, the team was finally given the go-ahead to excavate the site because the ground penetrating radar found evidence of 55 graves. And in the end, after 4 years of work, they found all those 55 graves, proving that the GPR, ground penetrating radar, was a reliable method. The official record claimed that there was only 31 burials. And the GPR ends up being important because a lot of locals and other people were giving pushback to those results of 55 burials because they were like, oh, well, that could be animals or trash pits or whatever. But the GPR and the archaeological knowledge of the team, it's very specific and they knew what they were looking at. And it was very obvious that they were graves and not anything else. When the remains were tested, it was found that nearly 70% of the boys buried at the school were African American. In other words, 7 out of every 10 kids who were buried at Dozier were Black, without counting the 7 white boys who were chained to their beds in a single incident when the white dormitory was burned down in 1914. We all came back for them. We remembered. Richard Huntley, the president of the White House Boys, told a reporter, "If they could hear us today, we came back for you. You boys can go home today." The USF investigation was focused on finding those who had family members buried at Dozier so that they could collect DNA and try to match the remains. This task was done in collaboration with the University of North Texas Health Sciences Center. They did this so that even in the event that they could not find familial matches now, all of the found remains DNA would be stored so that one day potential family members could be found. 8 bodies in total were identified using DNA matching. 14 more were presumed identifications using a combination of historical records, artifacts at the burial site, and burial context. What makes it tricky to identify these remains is that they were children, so they have no direct descendants, which means that they would need maternal relatives' DNA to positively identify any of them, because maternal DNA is passed down in the same mitochondrial DNA. However, all this to say, Over 100 boys died at the Dozier School. So that means that there are still many remains that have not yet been located. Some records state that remains were sent to families at the times of their death and they were buried by the families. But in the book, Erin goes to one of these off-campus grave sites to exhume the boy's remains for positive identification and to account for him in her records, but the coffin was empty. So this doesn't really give a whole lot of weight to the school's records that state boys were buried at family cemeteries. And although we focused on the Dozier School, the conditions were just as bad and abusive at Okeechobee, the school's second site. This site actually didn't close until 2020, when the contract between the Florida Juvenile Justice Department and the private operator was not renewed. But don't worry, they're going to put a data center there, so great. While reading We Carry Their Bones, it reminded me of a book I had read earlier this year called Madness, Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow South by Antonia Hilton. And this book was about the Black-only, then later on segregated Crownsville Asylum in Maryland. It definitely deserves its own episode, but the way that the mental hospital was ran was very similar to the Dozier School. First, the patients were the ones that built all of the facilities. There was also rampant abuse, overcrowding, underfunding, diseases, just awful conditions, but not much was done to stop it because not only were these patients Black, but they were also had mental health issues or were otherwise unwanted. And I just wanted to acknowledge the similarities in how these two state-run facilities failed to help and treat the patients and children that they were put in charge of to protect and watch. And then just a little interesting side note, kind of similar, like on the same vein, when Erin is talking to one of her collaborators, he tells her that she should also look into the state hospital there because they had thousands of deaths at this hospital, and so much so that they even had a casket factory on site at this hospital in Jackson County. So that's crazy. The Dozier School for Boys also reminded me of the Native American boarding schools in the US, and this included Hawaii and Alaska, and also Canada ran Native boarding schools. This was where young Native children were forced to attend by violently tearing them away from their families. They would have their clothes, hair, and any other sort of Indian parts of their appearance removed, and they were not allowed to speak in their native languages. Similarly to the Dozier School, abuse and violence were rampant and many children died while at these boarding schools, which was also covered up and never spoken about. There was around 400 of these schools across 37 states, and it's now estimated that over 1,000 children died at these schools from 1871 to 1969. And this has only started to be publicly talked about and even discovered in the last few years. But don't worry, we will be doing an episode on Native boarding schools. I just wanted to point out the similar ways that government institutions abused minority children. All right, to wrap things up, let's talk about a few things that happened after the book by Erin was published to round out the story. In 2018, there was a resolution passed by the Florida legislature acknowledging the state's responsibility for their pain and suffering of so many boys at Dozier. In 2023, a memorial was dedicated to honor the victims who were abused and in some cases died at the Dozier School for Boys. I'll post a link to the memorial ceremony pictures in the episode description. It's a very moving memorial. It's near where the actual White House is on the grounds of the school. This area is also being developed into the Jackson County Museum and Dozier Memorial Park. And as part of this resolution, there's supposed to be a memorial at the state capitol in Tallahassee, but from what I looked into, it doesn't seem like that one has been built yet. In 2024, Florida state lawmakers allocated $20 million to be equally divided among the school's surviving victims for both Dozier and Okeechobee. Ahead of the filing deadline, the state of Florida received more than 800 applications for restitution, attesting to the mental, physical, and sexual abuse they endured at the hands of the school personnel. And that'll come out to be about $21,000 for 926 people, but I don't know, that doesn't seem like enough money to me, but I don't know if you can really pay away trauma. So at least I'm just surprised that Florida in this day and age is acknowledging these harms, so I guess that's a positive. And I'd like to end the episode by hearing from Tananarive Due, Erin Kimmerle, and Robert Straley, a survivor of the Dozier School. Tananarive said about writing the Reformatory, "I started writing this book to give Robert Stevens a different story, but the research provided unexpected bonding time with my father soon after the death of my late mother, civil rights activist Patricia Gloria Stevens Due. My mother loved horror, so the Reformatory is a highly fictionalized ghost story, but the horrors of history are real, and I'm so grateful that my parents taught me that change is possible when we fight for it." She also said that, I believe I may have discovered the remedy for my childhood fears of death and loss at last. Remembering is the one and only thing that can make time stand still." Robert Straley, who was 70 years old at the time, said of his work with the White House boys and bringing awareness to the horrors and abuse that occurred at Dozier, "This might be my legacy. I think it's the only thing that I've ever done that's not for myself." And Erin Kimmerle, reflecting on what she's learned from her line of work, "I've done this type of work for more than 20 years, and never has the family of someone who was missing or murdered told me they didn't want to know the details. No one chooses ignorance. They want to know. No one can ever make it right. No restitution is enough. The deed cannot be undone. Justice itself is elusive. There can be acceptance, though, and that is what carries one forward. I've learned only truth can enable healing." The story of the boys at the Dozier School reminds me of so many other times throughout U.S. history where awful events are figuratively and literally buried and never spoken about again. They aren't in our history books or collective memories. Whether it be the boys at Dozier, the Native children at boarding schools, the men, women, and children of Greenwood, Rosewood, Bear Creek, Wounded Knee, among others. That's why I think it's so important to learn all of our history, the good, the bad, the ugly. These innocent people deserve to be known, to have their stories told. The least we can do is to honor their memories by telling their stories and learn from our past so that we can prevent things like this from happening again. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Yappin' About History. I hope you learned something new and are reminded that what we do today will shape the stories that are told tomorrow. History isn't just something we remember, it's something we carry with us. I'll see you next week. Bye.